critical mass of people who've joined, so I suggest we get started. Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody who's joined. Welcome for those who are seeing this later. I'm super excited to be here introducing to APAC and the world, Bradley Sherman and the Super Age. My name is Stephen Johnston. I'm the co-founder of Aging 2.0 and the founder of Thought Castle, which is a consulting company. And I've been working in this space for the last 10 years, looking at aging innovation, and really interested in what Bradley has now put in this book and has talked about, which is really a fundamental shift in society. And I couldn't be more excited and couldn't be more aligned with the messages that Bradley has introduced and is sharing here with this book. He is a real expert. I think Chip Conley described him as a prognosticator of the future of our new longevity economy and longevity society. And I think that covers it well. He's had a background at AARP, working with some large corporates and innovators of all shapes and sizes, but also with a very international perspective. I'm here based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been here for the last couple of years. Before that in UK, before that in San Francisco and New York. And we are, very much everywhere I go, there's just such an interest in understanding the international aspects of aging and longevity. And I think a lot of them are really captured nicely in this book. Hopefully many of you had a chance to have a sense of what's in it. It's available for sale. The links are going to be available here. But the things that struck out for me was really some important statistics, such as the fact that 8% of population GDP, the global GDP is represented by countries that are rapidly aging. We are seeing massive impact of ageism in terms of 63 billion impact in US economy. But on the other hand, we've seen massive market opportunities. For example, the massive transformational wealth happening through the generations. And the book really peppers these data with very specific, colorful anecdotes. And so we're going to get into some of these, and Bradley's going to share a little bit about his process and his sort of inspiration for the book, and then give us a reading. So I think I'll, with that, just sort of turn it over to Bradley to introduce himself and the book, and then we'll dive into the discussion. So welcome, Bradley.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you so much for hosting this evening in the US, this morning in Asia, and of course, early afternoon in the Pacific. It's really lovely to be with all of you today. Some of you who I've known for years, others of you who I hope to know in the near future. As Stephen said, we're going to talk a little bit about the book today. We're going to talk about how our demographics have changed radically over the past century. But before we do so, I want to talk about this movement of aging and longevity and this shift in demographics. And it's really being led by a number of different organizations around the world. Stephen, of course, thank you to Aging 2.0, your leadership in this space, but also to those launch partners that have helped make today possible by extending invitations to their network. The Aging Care and Enrichment podcast, Aging Asia, Partners in Change, Staying Connected, and the Yamano Beauty College. As we begin the conversation today, I'd like to give those of you who don't know me a bit of a background on how I got to this place. You see, I've been in aging now for nearly 25 years. Yes, 25 years. I'm 45 years old. I started noticing the shift of our populations when I was in college. I traveled between my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Washington, D.C., and see the demographic change happening in real time along the highway between those two cities. The populations between Pittsburgh and Washington would become older and whiter and poorer, and more people will be involved in work, which I found to be somewhat strange. I wanted to uncover why this happened. So I went into the field of aging, in part because of this, also because I had a personal connection. My grandparents were in long-term care. I spent the first part of my career with an organization called Leading Age. Leading Age is the national nonprofit in the United States for the long-term care industry. I spent about 3.5 to 4 years there before being recruited to AARP, where I spent nearly 15 years of my career. It was an amazing place to work in the sense that I got to travel around the world, I got to meet incredible people and design really great pieces of research and initiate really incredible relationships with organizations like the Asia Development Bank, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Economic Forum. One of the highlights of my career there was publishing the Aging Readiness and Competitiveness Report, which is still available today. Today, I'm the founder and CEO of the Super Age, which is a research and advisory firm that helps major corporations around the world, as well as mom and pops, understand the demographic change that's facing us in this country, the United States, but also around the world. Because demographic change is something that affects all of us, much like climate change. The Super Age is also the impetus for writing this book, The Super Age: Decoding Our Demographic Destiny. In large part because I felt that there was no proper place in the market for a book yet like this. No one had written one that really expressed the history, the challenges that we face across society if we do nothing, as well as the opportunities that can exist in this new era. The book itself, it's divided into 3 sections. The first is a history of age. The second is demographic dystopia. And the third is called A New Demographic Order. In the history of age, I talk about our long-term relationship with older populations and the fact that consistently they've remained inconsistent for all of human history. The last 100 years or so have been particularly difficult for older populations as they've been marginalized by ageism. The second section of the book focuses on a demographic dystopia. Essentially, what happens if we do nothing? It talks about racial inequalities, regional inequalities, and how those can build up over time to create varying longevities, where people who are richer, living in more urban environs, can expect to live very long, healthy, successful lives, while people who are poorer, living in more rural environs or historically marginalized populations will die at a younger age. Stephen's asked me to take a reading from the book today to share a bit from the more optimistic side, to talk about in the third section, A New Demographic Order, and the chapter, A New Novel Reality Emerges, in talking about the middle plus. As lifespans continue to lengthen, it is inevitable that people will have the opportunity to do more. It is also likely that they will need to work longer. This will likely lead to the emergence of new life stages, as happened with teenagers and retirees in the 1950s. The middle plus is emerging. This is a group of people who are around middle age, but their age extends past traditional retirement age. I peg this group roughly between 50 and 74, but age is only a guideline. Middle plus people can be younger or older than this, and as long as they meet some basic criteria, such as work status and whether they have children living at home. I noticed this age bracket expansion in the early 2000s when I was reviewing demographic data on 50 plus women in the United States. In particular, I observed that women in their 50s or 60s could be both a mother, a grandmother, or a grandmother, and many of them were engaged in full-time or part-time work. This represented the future of longevity, the shifting consumer landscape, and the opening of the middle plus group. Market segmentation should be less about age and more about stage, economic condition, health status, outlook, and pegging people to their age is outdated. Mothers will always need the right tools to raise a child, whether they are 16 or 60 plus. Recent research by J. Walter Thompson echoed these observations. The company found a 55-year-old woman might be a grandmother or a new mother, a college leaver or an entrepreneur, a wild motorcyclist or a multi-marathon runner. Her lifestyle is not governed by age, but by her values and the things she cares about, her passions, ambitions, and goals. More than that, the company's observations confirm for me that this wasn't a new life stage only in the United States, but globally. The middle age as a whole is an economically active, aspirational group of people, meaning that they are engaged in some type of work and full of life. They may have dependent children or grandchildren, and they may be the primary or secondary caregivers for their parents. They just happen to be a bit older than us. And like my father, I've encountered some kind of health setback during or just after traditional middle life, which is 45 to 65 years. Like most, they have a fear of being seen as frail, disabled, old, or elderly, and do whatever they can to combat this perception. They have the resources to buy products and services to enhance their lives, as well as the lives of the people around them. They are wealthier than average because they have had the ability to work in higher paying jobs and have been proactive in their saving strategies. Companies would be wise to consider this consumer group because unlike previous generations, this group isn't interested in the beige-colored, function over form, poorly designed products and services that have plagued the longevity marketplace for decades. They are using the power of their pocketbooks to entice brands to design for their dynamic lives ahead. They are insisting that products be built for them, or at the very least, with them in mind. Businesses would also be smart to consider that just because people are living longer than previous generations, it doesn't mean that they are old. As the saying goes, age is just a number, and middle plus consumers don't like being seen as old and frail. From the beginning to middle to end, the super age is upending all parts of life and death. It will be a wildly complex and transformative period for humanity. It will provide enormous opportunities for businesses to look past chronological age and focus on consumers' wants and needs. Some companies are already doing this, but there is more than enough room for others to enter the market and meet the wants and needs of an increasingly age-diverse population. This highlights for me probably one of the most central theses of this book, which is a new life stage really is coming out of lengthening life. Too often, the average person, the lay person, tends to think that extending life means just tacking years on to the end. They think that it'll be more years in decline, more years sick, more years helpless, more years in a nursing home. But the reality is that's not true. The super age actually offers an opportunity for more years to be pushed into the middle of life, meaning that we get to experience and enjoy more than any other time before. And perhaps the greatest point is that because of this, the entire life course is adjusting, and it's adjusting pretty radically right now. So we went from, in the 1900s, a 3-stage life to then a 4-stage life and then a 5-stage life. I would argue now that with the middle plus and perhaps those who are at extended adolescence, well, we're almost at a 7-stage life. And that may sound insane. It may sound ludicrous. But when you think about the realities of our life course today, it seems pretty close to the truth. So with that, I'd like to offer Stephen, of course, the first question for conversation, and then I'd like to offer our launch partners a chance to come on screen. For those of you who are in the audience, you'll have an opportunity to post your question in the chat box, in the Q&A chat box below. Stephen, take it away.
Thank you, Bradley. And, you have a very nice reading voice. I think it's good to hear you go through it, and I like that particular piece because it really, as you say, focuses on this fundamental idea that we need to change our conception of what the life stages are. And I guess one question is where do we, or where in the writing of the book, where have you sort of got most excited about either organizations or people who can be sort of role models that can help others? Because this is really fundamentally different, what you're describing. It is not what we think about. It's not what advertising thinks about. It's not what corporates think about. So how do we start to sort of build using some case studies to kind of make this more of the way that people think about our new life stages? And before you answer that, just to your point, everybody's welcome to put Q&A in the chat box. Just start writing, and then we'll get it over the next few minutes after the launch partners. So yeah, who's good, and how do we use this?
It's a wonderful question, Stephen. Thanks for that. I think that there are two groups that tend to be the most exciting for me right now. Those are older women and millennials and Gen Z, which sounds like the two should be oil and water, but they're actually quite complementary. What excites me about the marketplace right now is that older women in particular have taken control of their own narrative, or are taking control of their own narrative. They're eschewing this idea that ageism somehow controls them, that it's a shackle, and they're showing themselves in bold, bright colors, doing things that their parents, their mothers certainly would have never dreamed of. And I believe that this is exciting because social media has given them license that would have not existed before. There are individuals from the early days of social media, Ari Seth Cohen comes to mind, who chronicled the lives of older women who were still fashionistas in New York City. And that opened the door for other women older women in particular, to present themselves to the world. And now you have some really sizable presence for these different women on Instagram, on TikTok. And you may say, okay, well, that's just a curiosity, but it's more than just a curiosity. These women are attracting major brands as sponsors. Now, in the traditional world, the pre-social media world, that would have never happened. It would have never existed that way, because Madison Avenue in particular, the place where most advertising is done here in the United States, would have said, older women, why would we use older women? But the reality is older women actually show what a future could look like for younger women, and younger women follow them in droves. And I think that's pretty spectacular. I also think that young men and women in particular have gotten kind of a bum deal. You know, we have a tough situation for them right now. Our systems were essentially predicated on growth. So pensions, healthcare, that was all this idea that the society would continue to grow, that we would have a good dependency ratio, and we just don't have that anymore. Younger people are really saddled with an incredible amount of debt and social systems that don't necessarily work for them. But, and this is a big but here, they're taking lemons and making it into lemonade. They're actually thinking about the problems that are there and how to solve for them. So whether that's Upside Home, which is a Florida-based co-housing company that's moving people into market rate housing, the Golden Girls model, as they call it, or a new startup that's actually been founded by one of my former interns called Italy, which connects caregivers to financial resources that are available within the government to help ease that burden of taking care of a loved one. There are some really spectacular things happening. And of course, there's everybody in between too. Everyone who's on this call, I took a close look at the list. Everyone who's on this call is doing some really important work in their home countries, some within their regions and some throughout the world. So this is just a top line observation of what's really exciting me right now. The biggest part is generations are doing different things, all working towards the same goal, a more equitable and just future.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. I'll maybe ask just one more question, and then we'll turn over to the launch partners, if that's okay.
Yep.
Which I think your point about the intergenerational compact is really interesting, and I do hope, and I like the optimism, and I'm generally optimistic too. But I also see there's some tensions and clouds on the horizon, specifically around climate change. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing more is the connection between environmental quality of life and health-driven quality of life. And so we are seeing quite a big disconnect and growing inequality between those who would like to live that middle stage with vibrance and vigor, but perhaps because of environmental challenges and bad air pollution, which is impacting their quality of life, and the big health inequalities that we're seeing and frankly are growing. Are you optimistic that we can reduce those inequalities?
Well, I don't think we have a choice. If we don't do it, it's a bit like the adage, do you pay now or do you pay later? And typically when you pay later, you're paying a lot more. These problems can be fixed today if we take them on. But if we wait, the gap grows wider and wider. I talk often about how the longevity gap in this country has just radically expanded over the course of the last 100 years. And it's really troubling now. It's beyond what is acceptable. And in my own city, I live in Washington, D.C., for those of you who don't know me, there's a 27-year gap between the richest rich and the poorest poor. That's crazy. Nationwide in the United States, from the highest longevity to the lowest longevity is 42 years. That's 2 generations, from the highest income populations to the lowest income, which happen to be pretty consistently connected to race in this country. And it's also worldwide. One of the highest life expectancies in the world is Monaco, at around 87 years old. And one of the lowest life expectancies in the world is Chad, around 56, if I'm not mistaken. So there is a lot that can be done. There is a lot that needs to be done. Older populations do tend to be more negatively impacted by the environment. So I do agree with you that there's some coalescing around that subject matter. Here in the United States, we actually saw great coalescing around Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020. Cell phone data actually showed that the people who were showing up to protests were young men and women and old men and women. The people who like us, middle-aged folks, they didn't show up at all, or certainly not in the same numbers. So I think there is hope for an intergenerational pact. And one of the things I talk about in the book, Stephen, is the concept of OK Boomer, which seems to flare here and there. And I had a wonderful editorial team at HarperCollins. I had Hollis Heimbush, who was my primary editor, and 2 junior editors, Rebecca Raskin and Wendy Wong. And there was only one time where we got into a struggle in the book, and that was over my read on OK Boomer, which I saw as relatively ageist. Well, it turns out that younger populations don't see it as ageist at all. Younger populations see it as a term, a general blanket term for people who are out of touch and not ready for this new era of humanity. Now, that was a bit of a revelation for me, because it gets to the point of, we have to listen, we have to communicate if we're going to move forward. And I appreciated that point of view. And I think it comes through in the narrative that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think there's some really interesting countercultural things going on that me in my 40s, are just sort of unaware of. And I think there's something nuanced there. I'd love to have more of a conversation with the Gen Zs and all generations in the same room at the same time to just hash it out, because I think each person has got each perspective, can add. I wanted to get to Sarah had a question. I don't know if there's others, but I thought it was a very interesting one. Which sort of really, Sarah Mitran talks about resilience, essentially, which is how do you anticipate older people being able to support themselves after being impacted from divorce, single parenting, recession to caregiving, and ageism? It's been a tough, few years, and I think we're obviously seeing stresses across the whole population. But is there something about resiliency and the ability to bounce back that you address in the book and explore?
I do. It was writing a book like this in a pandemic is a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it's a solitary process that only becomes more solitary over the course of being sequestered away during quarantine after quarantine. But on the other hand, it offers some insights into how the rest of the world is behaving during a period of high stress. And I think we saw consistently across the board, older populations were more resilient than younger ones in dealing with the stresses of the pandemic. They tended to surprise employers. I don't know why. I still haven't quite figured out why employers thought that older folks that worked for them couldn't figure out tech, but they were surprised at how well they moved into tech and used tech. And more importantly, how well their work product continued throughout, stay-at-home remote working. So that's a very positive thing. I think to get to the heart of the question, though, we are talking about a fundamental shift in the total social contract. It has to happen. So people will need to work longer. In order for that to happen, though, we do have to take on things like ageism pretty head on. Now, ageism, it's part of everything that we do. It is an ingrained bias, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working against it at all costs. As we focus on the larger piece of what should older people do to remain resilient long term, if that's what I understand the root of the question to be, all people need to realize that life is a marathon and not a sprint. And in order to stay ahead of the curve consistently throughout your life, you have to keep up on your skills at every turn. You have to present yourself as relevant and connected at all times. And you have to present yourself in a way that you would expect others to receive you. And that's a very positive thing to aspire to. Don't fall into the traps of looking and feeling and being old, falling into those stereotypes, because people will seize upon those if they see them. If they see those stereotypes appear, then they will seize upon them, and it will basically be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think the biggest piece too, to get to the real heart of the matter is, don't fall out of employment. If there's one piece of advice to give, I know that's probably way too generalized, but staying relevant as long as possible in the workplace is essential. Don't leave before you absolutely want to. That's one of the things that's happened during the pandemic that's not fully covered in the book, obviously because of publication schedules, but there has been a mass exodus of older workers here in the United States. And that's causing a lot of our norms as it relates to the hiring and firing of people, the moving around of folks from job to job, the rethinking and reimagining of benefits. That's because of older workers. The reality is, though, it takes an older worker on average twice as long as a younger worker to get back into the workforce, and typically they make half as much. So try to stay in. And if you're thinking about leaving, don't. People always leave before they should.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point about the future of work, which is obviously sort of parallel set of conversations. And what we're seeing, just a massive transformational shift there, and this rise of gig economy workers, and the concept of work being much less binary than it was before. And I don't know about you, but I sort of have changed my opinion from the sort of the gig economy being sort of exploitative to actually, if it's done well, you can imagine it being something that is on people's terms, whether it's driving Uber or Airbnb, which has a famously high level of participation from older people. So I'm kind of wondering if you could also, what you think about the gig economy aspects, and if there's things that we need to do, for example, transferable insurance or pension schemes that are not designed for a world in which we're not all working in factories 9 to 5. The sort of the future of work with the future of a much less binary workforce is probably has a whole lot of implications for policy, how corporates think about their own pension systems and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to have, like you said, I think we have to rethink the pension systems at whole, writ large. Retiring at 65 when we're healthy and active at 65 no longer makes sense. I'm sorry. I know it sounds nice to retire at 65, but that is outdated, and it's frankly unfair for most future populations. That's a hard pill to swallow. That being said, as we transition to later life in this new period, one of the things that we know consistently across all age groups is that flexibility is the number one thing that they want. Number one across the board. Right now, one of the easiest ways to get to flexibility is through gig work, like you mentioned, and also entrepreneurism. The problem with entrepreneurism has and continues to be that we have a bias against it for some reason. I think because we hear of entrepreneurs as being people like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, we think of these big unicorn type companies that these are the only men and women that are allowed to be entrepreneurs. But the reality is, setting up an LLC, hanging your shingle outside, being a consultant, that's all entrepreneurism. Opening a sidewalk cafe or, any type of work like that is entrepreneurism. So it shouldn't be looked down upon based on the size of your company. And the reality is that entrepreneurs are the driving force in the American economy. I can tell you that without any hesitation or reservation. We have to be able to live in a world where we encourage people to innovate, because small and medium-sized enterprises, they're the fuel that keeps the fire of our economy burning.
Yeah, and I think, and Troy's comment, I guess, is along these lines, which is sort of, to the extent that we can, hang on to a job versus going out contracting. I think it's sort of presumably a fairly individual decision. But the idea, maybe we can sort of mix that also with Des's question, which is more about sort of a broader piece about acceptance. It does feel that there is a societal shift that's needed about this concept of super aging. I love the term. It's very sort of positive. It sort of seems rather fabulous, and it's also vague enough to that you don't really know exactly what it is, but it's with a negative connotations. But to Des's point, how do we really get acceptance to improve this idea of society accepting what super ages are and having them central to society going forward?
I hate to break it down to complete economic terms, but I'm going to break it down to complete economic terms. It's an issue of supply and demand, Stephen. For the past, since the first boomer was born and entered the workplace in the 1960s, we have had a constant glut of employees and workers, at least in the Western world, but frankly, worldwide. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a country that is entering the super age or suffering some type of demographic disruption due to altering birth rates, where they're falling below replacement. I mean, just before the holidays, India of all places dropped below replacement rate. I would have never expected that in my lifetime, that India of all places would drop below replacement rate, and it's there now. So this change that's happening is really speeding up all around us. And I think the first thing we're going to see is a mass return to work or remain in work of older populations. Guess what happens? When older populations stay in the workplace, they're seen. They're seen as part of us because they're contributing to the economy, they're contributing to society, they're consumers. And they're with us. They're with us in this great social experiment that we call life. When people leave the workforce, when people go into retirement, when they become old, they become others. They become dependents. And with this new age upon us, I think we'll see a lot more older people staying in work for longer periods of time, both out of want and out of necessity. And that's necessity for their own pocketbooks, but also the necessity of keeping the economy strong and firing on, frankly, all cylinders. And as we know, Stephen, just one additional point to that, we know that when older people are in the workforce, we do better. We know that. There's enough data to support this now. Diversity counts in the workplace. It helps us build better products and services at the end of the day. It might be a little difficult to manage at times, but it works. It works. It consistently works. And in fact, when 2/3 of automobiles in this world now are purchased by people over the age of 50 years old, I think I want older workers on the line doing innovation and design and marketing and communications to make those products meet the demands of this population. If I have a bunch of 20-somethings designing cars for people who are 65 plus, I think we have a major problem.
Yeah. The exciting thing to some of the initiatives around the world in terms of design thinking, intergenerational co-creation, I think it's exactly, and you talk about in your book, and exactly where we need to go. I do, going back to the employer perspective there, completely agree on the diversity perspective, but it does seem I was having a conversation here in Australia, which I think is probably somewhat, similar to other countries, where with some of the folks in large corporates who were in charge of the diversity agenda, and as far as they thought their agenda was nothing to do with age. It was to do with gender. It was to do with LGBT. And you ask them, actually, what are your stats and what are your policies around age diversity? And it was just surprisingly, for me anyway, I was quite surprised that it wasn't really part of their discussions. And I think that we have an education piece.
Yeah, and there's some stats in the book, and I apologize, they don't ring out right now in my head, but the top line is this: most companies worldwide completely understand that age diversity should be part of their DEI initiatives, but only a fraction of those companies are actually doing something about it. I'm not a huge believer in DEI. I mean, I think it's an important thing for us to embrace, but I think a lot of times the way it's implemented is a bit soft, and managers tend to dig their heels in quite literally and say, I know the way I'm doing my work and I'm not going to change. We're also fighting against, the bulk of the workforce, being somewhere between, 35 and 50 years old. And people who are in that age group, we tend to want to hire people who look like us, who act like us, who share the same values as us. So it's a bit of a hurdle to get, the middle managers, the middle level people in these companies on board. One of the big challenges, though, Stephen, that I faced, even in my own work and talking with corporations, is sometimes the C-suite, who are made up of people who are clearly within this age demographic, and of basically saying, well, I'm not old. I'm doing fine. Why would we need to do something special for this cohort? So, you can call it ageism if you want, but I think there's a reality of otherism that exists more. And sometimes people can't see themselves for their own chronological age. I mean, I know I struggle with that from time to time. I don't see myself as 44 necessarily. And I think Debbie Harry, who was the lead singer for Blondie, probably said it best when she released her, seventh album. She says, I'm 72 down here, but I'm 20 up here. And I think that rings true for quite a few people. I'm not the only one.
We did some research for that. We're interviewing an 80-year-old, and we asked him why he didn't use the TV, and he said, "Oh well, I'll watch the TV when I'm old." And old is always 10 years older than you are, I think.
Well, I mean, in my grandfather's case, he lived across the hall from this man who was a month older than him. They were both born in 1914. And until my grandfather's dying day, he referred to that guy as the old guy across the hall. So it's all perspective. We have to take that into reality, that we're perceiving the world from where we sit. And, where, today, somebody who's 70, 75, even 80 in some cases, doesn't feel old to me like it used to. And that's because my own perspective has changed.
Sure. Sarah has an interesting question around immigration. This idea that we do have these aging populations, as you mentioned, and how is immigration going to factor into that? Will there be more openness? I mean, Japan is famously
closed,
but they have a desperate shortage for caregivers. What do you see the immigration issue playing
in? Like I said, this is a global phenomenon, population aging. So with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa and perhaps a handful of countries in Latin America, most countries are aging at a pretty rapid rate. So we're going to have to reconsider how care is delivered. We are going to have to lean into technology as a solution more often. And I think, where we might, scoff at the way the Japanese have handled this, it actually offers a pretty good picture of what the future looks like for the rest of us, because immigration will be harder. You can't rob Peter to pay Paul, as we say. You can't take from one country and assume it'll solve the problems in yours without causing problems down the line somewhere else. And we're just limited in the sheer number of people that we have. So just to give put a very, very, very fine point on this, in 1900, the global population was about 2 billion people, 1.8 roughly. Because of innovations in the front end of life, as well as innovations in the middle part of life, we extended longevity, but we also caused the mortality rate to collapse for young people. That caused the global population to explode. So today it's roughly 8 billion people. We did that in just over 100 years. Congratulations to us. That population will continue to grow this century until it hits about 10 billion people, and then it stops. It stops, that's it. There's no more growth. We'll then start to decline pretty quickly after that. Now, you say, well, what do you do with all this? Well, we come up with solutions, obviously. We find solutions for problems that exist. Obviously, this caregiving issue is going to be substantial. Obviously, the technology is not there to fill the gap that a human being can. Obviously, we need to open the doors to some degree, at least in the short term, to get some help within these care centers. But a colleague of mine from your part of the world mentioned to me the other day, well, what happens when these folks are here and they don't have babies? Well, it's kind of kicking the can down the road. Okay, so all of a sudden now we have more people in who are aging within a country. The dependency ratio continues to grow. The short-term solution for us, the best term solution for us, has and continues to be extending working lives. More people in doing more types of jobs, maybe not the heavy lifting, but we are seeing companies that are developing technologies that are helping people extend the physical nature of work too, whether that be lifting people out of beds with a robo exoskeleton, or using technology in a way that aids the monitoring of older folks in particular, but throughout all care settings. These are things that will help streamline care. And of course, I fully believe in the emergence of the metaverse. And I fully believe that that's going to completely alter the way we deliver care. It's going to streamline and find new efficiencies for delivering care. It's going to allow us to stay at home for longer periods of time and be monitored externally. So if we're thinking purely in today's standard, we've got a huge problem ahead of us. But if we're thinking forward even 10 or 20 years, I think the burden's going to be alleviated to a large degree because of tech, IoT, and home monitoring.
Awesome, great. I think we have a question from Jeff from Partners and Change.
Great, can we put Jeff on the screen? Hey there, Jeff.
Are we there now?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, well, first of all, congratulations, Bradley. This is fantastic to see the book launched today. It's been a long time coming. I've known, just for people for other context, I've known Bradley for about the last 11 years, and he's been influential in the work we're doing here in Australia and New Zealand, and helping organisations adapt to the ageing of the workforce. There's a lot that you've talked about today that I could pick up on, but we won't do that. What I wanted to ask you, Bradley, was probably a much more of a personal question, which others might not be able to ask you, but I know I can. I'm always curious when people write a book such as you have, and also do the number of interviews and podcasts that you've been doing over the last 3 to 4 weeks, as to how this focus has changed your own view about your own aging. Are you thinking differently about yourself as a result of this whole process and the writing that you're doing? So it's a personal question. You can share what you wish, but I'm just curious.
I have always been very connected to the subject of aging, because aging and demographic change have just fascinated me. These are things that are in our control, but not in our control at all. Our aging process is the same way. Obviously, there's plenty of things that we can do to extend our lives, be it social or health interventions. But I think about my own mortality quite a bit, and the things I'm going to need in the near future and the long future. And as I mentioned, I live in Washington, D.C. in the district, and I live in a home that was built in 1895. And as I look around my home, I think about it every day, how it will not be able to meet my needs for the future. So I'm constantly thinking about, how do I retrofit this place to allow me to stay at home for a longer period of time? Because consistently, and this is research that's done by been found at least by virtually every major aging organization throughout the world now, is that people want to stay at home. They want to stay at home for as long as humanly possible. They want to choose where they live. They want to stay within their community, and they don't want to go into an advanced care setting. And they will do just about anything in theory that they can to avoid that. In practice, though, it's a bit different. People do tend to push off those decisions about retrofitting a bathroom, or considering where a ramp might be placed, or an elevator if need be, and they can afford it. For me, Jeff, I think about this every day of my life. How can I make my house work for me long term? What can be done here? And in fact, it's become such a fascination and a fixation for me that with a couple of partners, we're launching this week a subsidiary called Kiba that's going to focus exclusively on inclusive design, both in the home, but also within hospitality and within the workplace. I think the other thing, Jeff, that I've considered quite a bit is what people need to do, what I need to do to remain relevant as a functioning, contributing member of society. How can I stay relevant within the workplace? How can I continue to fight against these issues around ageism where they exist? How can I show myself as a equal partner in the community, not fall into that other category? So I think that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but it is obviously a personal one, and those are two places where I think I like to focus in.
Thank you for the great question, Jeff. And you gazumped me a little bit. I was going to ask Bradley a personal question at the end, and I might sort of leave it out there for him to noodle on, which was, how do you want to die? There were some really lovely innovations mentioned in the book around the fact that 9 out of 10 people in the States want to have more control over their end of life. Mm-hmm. I personally, and there's some quite nice innovations and startups and sort of cool ideas. I think generally what you don't shy away from in the book, which I welcome, is the importance of talking about the whole of life and also thinking about a good end. We've got a project called Pinkoro Society, which is essentially about how to have a good life to the very end and then a good death. But actually, a lot of the aging discussions tend to be about how we can stay fit and healthy as 40-something-year-olds forever. Yeah. But don't sort of understand or appreciate also the end of life. So I don't know if we want to discuss that now, but
I think we have to. There's a organization here called the Order of the Good Death. And what they promote is a better relationship with our own mortality. One of the things that we as humans have always done is fight against dying, which is kind of wild because the Reaper always bats 1,000. He has never missed a mark. So with that in mind, why do we have this obsession with immortality? Why do we have this obsession with youth? Well, it's in large part driven by media, but it's, I think, in other parts, just kind of so deeply ingrained in our minds as humans, this idea that we might be able to cheat it, that we sometimes miss out on the fact that we will expire. And having a good relationship with death, understanding that your time will come, can actually contribute to you living a much healthier life for a longer period of time, because you take those interventions seriously, those that can help you stay healthier and more active for longer periods of time. Not necessarily keep your 20-something or 30-something body, but stay healthy, stay fit, and stay mentally sound.
For sure. I'm going to ask a question from Kay, although I think she just stepped out. But I think it's a broader question around intergenerational fairness when it comes to healthcare. In the UK, they've been championing the QALYs, which is sort of quality adjusted life years, which is sort of deciding on what health interventions to give people based on how many, the quality of the remaining life years that they expect you to have. And if you think about it, that's almost always going to skew to provide care to younger people and not provide care for older people, just from the mathematics. And in Kay's question, she's a fellow Melburnian, it looks like, and looks saying the hospitals here are starting to turn away older people like we've seen last year because of COVID caseloads and send older people straight to palliative care.
Yeah.
Sort of, it's a gnarly one, but how do we sort of deal with the moral issues as they relate to limited resources, especially in times of pandemic?
I mean, you're probably talking to the wrong person about a healthcare system that works, because we don't have one that works here. My family is in healthcare, and I think at last check there, one of the main hospitals in Pittsburgh, my hometown, most of the ICU beds were taken up by people who weren't vaccinated. So the strains on the healthcare system have never been particularly fair, nor have they been particularly equitable. And the question of rationing care, it's as old as, the healthcare systems that we have. We have to make choices. Sometimes they're hard. I think turning away people for care because of their age could not be any more ageist. If hospitals are going to make decisions about who gets care and when, they should be focused on a number of different metrics, not simply based on age. But obviously, not being in Melbourne and not knowing the system intimately, it's difficult for me to answer that question with great certainty, unfortunately. But no decision should ever be based exclusively on somebody's age. And I have heard of that in other healthcare systems. Oh, he can't get this treatment because he's 80. That's unfair, especially when you've paid in. But there's also the reality that healthcare systems have to address. And the biggest one being that end-of-life care is incredibly expensive. Most of our healthcare costs do come at the last couple of years of life. So this balancing act that folks have to do that are in leadership roles, I mean, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. It's not a pleasant decision to make, but they're forced to do it every day.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. If there's any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I would like to kind of start to wrap up in terms of thinking about, it's been a couple of very busy years, presumably since you started just the journey of writing this book. Are there areas that you haven't included that you would have liked to, given the way the world has moved so quickly since you first started putting pen to paper?
That's a tough question, Stephen. Maybe the best one of the night. The challenges that exist before us really do need to be approached from a generationally diverse lens. I would have loved to have put more work into the book. I also really want to talk about what depopulation looks like, because that is the next reality. But again, like I said, I had a really phenomenal team at Harper that directed me through some of this, and their opinion was, don't get ahead of your skis. People can barely embrace this idea that our populations are getting older, that our birth rates are in sharp decline. Talking about depopulation, they're never going to be able to embrace this. But the reality is, depopulation is already a reality for a lot of populations and a lot of communities around the world. It's not limited to Japan. It's not limited to those exurbs and rural communities in Japan. It's happening here in the United States. As we define super age communities, and I don't think we spelled this out earlier, but super age is a technical definition where 1 out of 5 people is over the age of 65. Well, believe it or not, in the United States, there are 4 states that are super aged already. Those are the states of Maine, Vermont, West Virginia, and, no surprise, Florida. But the reality is, there are nearly half of the counties across the United States have median populations that are around 50 years old, median age populations that are around 50 years old. So depopulation is coming. It's happening in places already. There's a chapter of the book called Canaries in the Coal Mine. It's a bit of a homage to my grandfather who was a miner. But the canaries in the coal mine are the warning signs of what's to come. Rural communities right now, if there's one thing I want you all to take away from this today, is remember this: rural communities are a harbinger of our future. And if we don't take a close look at them and what's affecting them as it relates to demographic change, we're missing the plot. They can offer us a lot of solutions, a lot of opportunities to understand what the real implications of change mean for a society. And if they go unchecked, it's awfully ugly. I mean, it's really, really depressing to see the way that some of these communities have been left to just flounder. They lose their schools, they lose their health systems, they lose their main street, then they lose their big box retailer, and oftentimes they lose their bank, and then they can't even get access to capital. So I heard people say rather flippantly, well, they can just move. No, they can't. There's no value in their land anymore. There's nowhere for them to go. So if there's a future you want to see that is dystopic, take a look at the countryside. That's what happens when we don't pay closer attention to things. And I hope that, taking a look at the depopulation piece, but also the rural piece, those are the pieces that I really want to zero in on maybe for the next book.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a wonderful book called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which talks about basically reclaiming large swathes of rural populations or rural land for the environment, and kind of then actually sort of some supportive sort of relocations with the government. The government is actually doing some interesting stuff in Japan with taxation that you can pay in one suburb and be sent to the other. So I think this is such a rich stream and rich sort of opportunity for discussions and policy and sort of innovation. And I think Jeff is probably the last question to end on, which is any surprises in terms of the response to the book so far?
I think it's been surprising that people who are in the field find it to be very interesting, and aging and longevity in particular, because folks are smart that are in this space. I mean, we've been in it for a while now. We know that there are some really cool players here. But when anybody who's been in the space for a long period of time says, I've learned something from it, it's incredibly humbling. And that's been the nicest surprise, I suppose. But like all things, we fall into some bias, and getting people to pick up the book that are outside of aging is sometimes a challenge. But when they read it, they're overwhelmed by the change that they actually know that's around them. I say this demographic change has been underfoot and everywhere for some period of time, and you can see it if you know where to look for it. And it's literally right in front of you. But too often folks refuse to see what sits in front of their faces. When they open their eyes, though, to that change, their whole world shifts. Their worldview completely alters. And I think that's pretty amazing. So, if there are asks of anyone that's with us today, it's obviously buy the book and read it if you haven't already. Write a review on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any of the sites that you buy it from, Goodreads, and post it to social media. Let people know about the book. Let people know about the thesis. Let people understand that this isn't just about old people. That is probably the most central message to this. It's not just about older people. It's about our collective future. And we have a once in a lifetime, once in 100-year opportunity to rebuild the world in a way that we want it to be. And the folks that are on this call are architects of this new age. So let's make it known to people this is not just about older populations, it's about all of us.
It's a very powerful message to end on. Thank you, Brady. Where can people find you and find the book?
You can find me at thesuperage.com. And of course, the book is on Amazon if you want to get it quickly. but you can find it at local retailers, typically bookstores that handle English language books within your country. Barnes & Noble, I think, sells globally, and the independent bookstores IndieBound. But I know there are a couple of companies that are selling, retailers that are selling in Australia, Stephen. So just keep your eyes out for them there. And of course, whenever you're tagging on social media, please, 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 please tag me and the Super Age.
Well, congratulations again, Bradley. Thank you for doing what you're doing and raising the these important topics and really having an impact and making waves. So I'm excited for your journey. I think for those who are listening to this, let you know that I think there'll be a recording available for those who might have missed it for other time zones. And do stay tuned, follow Bradley's work at those sites and read the book, and let's have a conversation about this important topic. Aging is for everyone.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you to our launch partners again, Aging 2.0, obviously, Aging Care Enrichment, Aging Asia, Partners in Change, Yamana Beauty College, Get Set Up, and Staying Connected. Thank you again so much.
Thanks.